So, I want you to imagine a scenario in your minds as we think about Romans chapter 11. It's rather a hypothetical scenario. Probably never going to happen, but you never know. So Fareham Borough Council have decided that the churches in the area are getting a little bit influential over the things that happen. And so in order to decrease the power that the churches have, they decide that anyone who has attended the church for more than 20 years will be expelled as of now. So some of you will not be here next week, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. And so you can perhaps imagine in your mind that things are going to look a little bit different for those that are left behind. Suddenly there will need to be a new leadership. I think Stuart would find himself on his own. Suddenly some of the activities that would go on would have to stop. Perhaps new ones will get started. Let's be positive and think that the church would keep going somehow, and, bit by bit, things would settle down. Perhaps some new members would come in, and the church would start to feel quite different. And then let's say in 5 years' time, the council suddenly realizes that actually the churches did quite a lot of good in the area, and perhaps kind of putting that on them wasn't such a great decision, and they decide, actually, you're allowed back in again. And so various people start to drift back in again. What do you think things will be like at that point? Do you think you'd find it easy to come in, those who are leaders, and find they're not in leadership anymore and others have taken over, perhaps much younger people? Or the activities that we're used to are no longer happening. There's a whole new bunch of songs being sung that you don't know. Or new hip and happening preachers that preach in a way you don't like. Or maybe you've got that this morning. But that's, as you think about Romans, that's what partly you've got to get your mind thinking about. At the time that Paul was writing, there had been a period where Emperor Claudius had said to those in Rome, all the Jews must leave. And so 40,000 Jews had to leave their homes fairly quickly and be gone, anywhere but Rome. And these were some of the founder members of the Roman Church. We can probably assume there were a bunch of house churches in Rome that were predominantly Jewish at the time, with a few Gentiles. But then the Jews suddenly go, and the church has to reform itself around those Gentiles. 5 years later, in AD 54, Emperor Nero then realizes that there were actually some economic benefits to having the Jews around, and so invites them back to be good for business. And so back come the Jews, instead of including some Christian Jews, some Messianic Jews, as we might call them. And they come back into the church to find it a very different place to be. And in fact, they're not really considered, they don't really have the same status that they had anymore. They're no longer leading it. They're kind of looked down on a bit more as partly a part of a sort of a set of people that are perhaps a bit more irrelevant than they used to be. So that's what we have to have going on in our minds as we think about the book of Romans. It's one of the longest letters that we have recorded from the ancient world that Paul has written. And in general, what he's trying to address is this issue of how do these Jews and how do these Gentiles come together in one united church? How should they think about each other and treat each other? Which is why these chapters that we've been studying, 9, 10, and 11, may seem like a bit of a bolt out of the blue in terms of the book, but actually was quite critical to this letter as Paul tries to help them to understand what should happen in terms of unity. So if we think back to where we've come from in the book, we can start to see these threads running through, if you haven't already, as Paul tells them the great news of how similar these two groups are. He says in chapter 3, with no distinction, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Both groups. Those who knew God in the past, those who've come fresh to it, you're all in the same boat. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And then he goes on to say, and all are justified by grace as a gift. He wants to point them to what is similar between them. And he wants to remind them that even though they were a messed up set of people, all of them in different ways, God has shown his great love for them in that while they were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christ died for them. And so now, the righteousness of God comes apart from the law. So those Gentiles who didn't have the law, or even the Jews that did but couldn't keep it, a different form of righteousness, a way of being made right with God has been shown through the Lord Jesus. This is great news. And so what for the people of Israel? So in chapters 9 and 10, Paul has been trying he's been sort of showing that on the whole, that often when he talks about all Israel, in quotes, he's sort of saying on the whole, the Jews have rejected righteousness by faith. We looked last week at how the Jews were very zealous for God. They were very enthusiastic, but they didn't have the right knowledge. They were doing a works-based salvation. They were trying hard. They thought that somehow they could earn God's favor, earn God's love. But what they had to learn, what the Jews had to learn, is it doesn't matter who you are, your best works will always keep you from God. When we were in house group months ago, probably last year, one of the things that really struck me, sort of the picture I have in my mind of coming to God by faith, is that it's a bit like we come to God like beggars. And I can imagine, perhaps a bit like Charles Dickens and Oliver Twist or whatever is kind of what I have in my head of, you have someone who's serving up the food and you have to come with your bowl. And anyone that comes with anything in their bowl to God, God says, I'm sorry, I can't accept that. I have no basis for you to give me a little bit of food. And it's only when we come with the empty bowl that God is able to fill us and go, yeah, I can accept that. And faith, for me, kind of works out in my head as, if we come bringing something to God, some sort of work that we think is good enough, God goes, I'm sorry, I can't accept that. The only thing he can accept is when we come empty and go, I've got nothing to offer at all. And then he goes, I've got what's needed. I have made the sacrifice. I have done that on your behalf. So God has the desire to save us, the ability to save us. He wants to forgive us. He wants to restore us and show us grace. And Paul is thrilled that the Gentiles who didn't know about these things are increasing number in the church. That's great. But the question then that sort of comes, that he kind of imagines these Romans asking was, well, is it too late for the Jews? Have they gone too far now to experience God's grace? Has God rejected them forever? And if you remember in our readings, Paul kept on saying an emphatic not at all and no. So we have these two sections, verses 1 to 10 and verses 25 to 32, where I think Paul wants to show us that it's not too late and not too far gone. And I think he also wants to show us that while we have breath in our lungs, we're never too far gone to experience God's grace, which is a great encouragement. We're never too far gone to experience God's grace while we still have breath in our lungs. But we're never too strong in ourselves that we're incapable of stumbling. Paul wants to remind us that even if we're down in the gutter, even if we've fallen off the bike, and we feel like we can't get up and there's no hope, God is able to put us back on, stand us firm, and restore us. It's not too late. Maybe there's someone in the room, and you know what you've done this week. Maybe no one else knows it. But you feel like you're in the gutter. Maybe someone watching online is too ashamed to come in the building because you know what you're like. But there's good news, because it's not too late. Now, what's Paul's argument for that? Why does Paul think there's still hope for the Jews and hope for others? And he gives two arguments here. In verse 1, I think it is, he talks about the fact of, well, there must be some hope for the Jews, because I'm one, he says. If God could take someone like me, who used to persecute Christians, and turn me into one, then there's hope for others. And then he also points us back to 1 Kings chapter 19. Now, if you remember the book of 1 Kings, maybe you don't, if you don't know the story, there's a prophet called Elijah, God's messenger. And he goes up on a mountain, and he takes the two groups of people, those who are worshipping idols, the Baal, and he takes himself, the God worshipper, and he gets 2 altars built. And he says, the God who is real will send down the fire. So get your altar ready, and then we'll call down fire. And the prophets of Baal, they do so, and they're chanting and screaming and cutting themselves, and nothing happens. And Elijah pours on the water in a time of drought. And then just prays a simple prayer, God, send the fire. And it comes. And there's this great victory. And you kind of think that Elijah on this great high would go on to do great things from there, but actually he goes away and goes into depression. Because he thought he was on his own. He thought he was the only one left believing in God. And he'd started to suffer from a Lone Ranger mentality. I'm the only one. And sometimes I think we can feel like that. We feel like we're on our own. And God has to remind Elijah, no, you're not on your own. You might not know where they are, but there are 7,000 scattered around. And sometimes I think we need to get outside of our sort of lone mentality and to go, there are others around. And sometimes it can be a great struggle to reach out to others. And sometimes those who are stronger need to perhaps take have a greater boldness in reaching out to those who might be struggling. But we can support each other. And so Paul says that just like there was a remnant in those days of people for God, so even in his day, there are these Jews set apart, still elected for God. And so that gave him hope that one day something greater was going to happen. And so Paul sees various positives. He tries to sort of look at what's happened and to see these sort of pockets of Jews and think, well, what's going on here? So the positive Paul sees is that because the Jews had been rejecting his message, he left the synagogues that he'd been preaching in and had gone to the Gentiles instead. On the face of it, that doesn't seem so great for the Jews, but the Gentiles, they accepted his message joyfully, at least some of them. And so the church was growing, and he sees that as a good thing. And what he's hoping is that response from the Gentiles will raise up jealousy in the Jews, he says. That's what he's hoping for, that they will look at God's blessing on the Gentiles and go, I want some of that. And they will see that they can respond to God too through faith. He sees that there's this partial hardening he talks about, that their hearts are hard right now, but somehow he sees a soft interior underneath. And so he it's been revealed to him that one day there is going to be an incredible revival amongst Jews. And again, he talks about all Israel being saved, which is unlikely to mean every single Jew, because as in Jewish literature talks about, it's as a whole. It's kind of an en masse kind of amount of Jews are going to come to faith in Jesus. Just like we might say, you always say that, or a good time was had by all, when that's unlikely to be true. That a big part of Jewish people one day is going to come to faith in Jesus Christ. I don't think Paul is trying to say that there's some sort of special means that somehow they'll be saved without Jesus, because the verse is talking about is this deliverer will come. That's Jesus. The deliverer has come. And as he works in their hearts, somehow, and Paul doesn't explain how, this big group of Jews is going to join the big group of Gentiles in praise to God. That's a great thing. Peter in Acts, a Jew himself, said, there is salvation in no one else. There is no other name by which men can be saved. So Paul looks at these Jews now and goes, there's a little remnant now, but there's great things coming. And I think this gives us hope too. That as we look around our church, as we look around our community or our nation or our world, we can have hope too. We're never too far gone that God isn't willing to redeem us or work in us or restore us. If we've got breath in our lungs today, it's not too late for us to cry out to God for what we need. Don't get me wrong. There is a day coming where it will be too late. There'll be one day it will be too late for all of us in this room. We will no longer have breath in our lungs. And the choices we've made will stick. If you need God's mercy today, then call out to him today. Do not wait, because today you have that opportunity. James, in his letter, says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Are we humble enough to draw near to God today? So that's the hope he gives for the Jews. And perhaps he's trying to build up in the Gentile minds a more positive view of the Jewish people and what's going to happen to them. But he's also got this warning for the Gentiles too. For the Jews, he wants to remind them that you might have fallen off the bike, but you can get back up again. But for the Gentiles, he wants to remind them, you're never too great that you can't fall. You need your helmet on too to protect you from the issues that you're going to face. They are not treating the Jews in the right way. And to illustrate this and sort of how they should view the Jews now, he wants to give a horticultural illustration. Now, I don't know how many of you here are gardeners. I used to do some gardening as a job as a teenager, but certainly I have never grafted one thing onto another. Has anyone here tried grafting? Okay, a few. So the illustration he gives is he's got one cultivated olive tree that someone has farmed, and he's got there. And then on the other side, he's got this wild olive tree. It is just all over the place. It's quite prolific on fruit, maybe, but looking after that, you kind of go, whoa, that is just out of control. And you've got this cultivated olive tree, but actually, it might not be that fruitful anymore. It's kind of lost a little bit of its verve, its vigor. It's not as it once was. And so he gives this illustration that a branch is chopped off that cultivated tree, And he chops off a branch of this wild tree, and he attaches the wild branch to that cultivated tree in the place of that other one. Now, it is possible to do that. It's not the normal way round. Normally, you take the cultivated tree and you put it on the wild tree to try and bring that tree under control. But Paul puts it the other way round as this example of this cultivated tree is Israel. It's the Jewish nation. And those roots are the rich cultural heritage that they have. And he says that these Gentiles are like this wild tree that was grafted into this cultivated tree. Now I looked up this morning about grafting. It's quite interesting sort of what it talked about. A horticultural technique whereby tissues of plants are joined so as to continue their growth together. As a general rule, the closer two plants are genetically, the more likely the graft union will form. And grafting between different families is rare. It doesn't work. It's extremely hard to take an apple tree and stick a tomato plant on it. And yet somehow God is going to take these Gentiles and these Jews together and grow them together. The idea is that the wild tree can be brought under control, but it helps to reinvigorate that perhaps fruitless tree. That together they hone and refine each other till both can produce good fruit. Isn't that a beautiful picture of how a church should be? Where we come together and we refine one another. The Jews needed to remember that the younger blood that had come in would perhaps bring immaturity with it. It would perhaps bring mistakes with it. Maybe these people were more emotional than the Gentiles. Who knows kind of what they were like? But that younger blood also brought with it the enthusiasm, the vigor, the excitement over this fresh salvation for them. And so the Jews shouldn't reject the Gentiles on that basis, despite the differences between them. But also the Gentiles would need to not look down on these Jews. We're told in chapter 9, to the Jews belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, the promises, the patriarchs, and of course Jesus Christ. And so they shouldn't look down on these Jews because it's the roots that are keeping them alive. But Paul thinks that they can coexist. Now, I want you to do something. I want you to look around at each other. Have a look around at each other. At these beautiful faces you see around you. If you're at home, you might struggle with that one. I can tell you it's a great sight, really. But as you look around, you will probably find people younger than you, older than you, a different gender, maybe a different race, maybe a different culture, maybe a different language, a different personality. I can probably almost guarantee that as you looked around, there's probably someone you looked at and thought, I don't really get on very well with them. I don't really like them. I struggle with them. And again, maybe you're looking at the preacher and going, I rather struggle with them. But somehow, Paul says, as a church, we can put aside those differences and join together in what we come together with, bringing to each other. That you who are older, you might find us younger people very loud. You might find us very emotional. You might find us very opinionated. As we look around at you older folk, we might go, oh, you're so stuffy, you're so irrelevant, you're so stuck in your ways, or whatever. but actually we have things that we can bring to each other. We want to bring out the strengths in each other. Paul says, don't be arrogant. You are not the best in this church. That no matter what gifts God has given you, you cannot stand on your own. That if you think you're standing strong, be careful you don't fall, Paul says elsewhere. Pride comes before a fall. You need me, I need you. We need each other. And we need to work hard at developing those relationships. And so what Paul wants to bring us to as he ends the chapter, verses 33 to 36, is that he tries to help us to have this sense of awe. Rather than having arrogance, he says, have awe. Tremble, he said in the version that we read. And Paul brings this great doxology, talking about God. And in some ways, the amazing things that God has done in bringing these two sets of people together. He's amazed by what God is going to do amongst the Jews. He's amazed that no one, including himself, is too far gone to experience his grace. And he's kind of like, whoa, I do not understand this. And so he kind of says, who has given God advice? Who can tell God what to do? Who can fathom his ways? Who is wise like him? And he is the first to admit he does not understand this. In house group this week, we were trying to get our heads round, where does God's sovereignty end and human responsibility start? And I don't think we really came to a great conclusion about how that's supposed to work. And the comfort for me is that we don't have to. We don't have to work it all out. You don't have to be intellectually amazing to be a Christian. You just need to trust that God can do what he said he's done and what he will do. We don't have to comprehend why some people will be saved and why others won't be. We don't have to understand why some things happen to us that just don't seem to make sense. It's okay to have doubts and questions. Because God is God and we are not. We have finite minds. We cannot expect to comprehend the God who is outside of time and outside of space because he made it. And so we're going to have to hold these tensions in our minds. We're not going to understand definitively how all the Jews will be saved, or how your next door neighbor who's such a lovely person doesn't come to faith, or any of these things. We're going to have to hold these tensions as we live our lives, and yet still somehow trust the God that is bigger than us. The quote that Paul quotes from is Isaiah chapter 40. And I thought I would just take time to read part of Isaiah chapter 40, because I think it just helps us to get our minds around who God is a bit more. So this is verse 12 of Isaiah chapter 40. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? Who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord, or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? And who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge, or showed him the path of understanding? Surely the nations are like a drop in a bucket, and they are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him all the nations are as nothing, and they are regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. With whom then will you compare God? To what image will you liken him? As for an idol, a metal worker casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and fashions silver chains for it. A person, too poor to present such an offering, selects wood that will not rot, and they look for a skilled worker to set up an idol that will not topple. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground, than he blows on them, and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. Pride comes before a fall. Paul then tried to excite us over God's mercy, and I hope you've had some of that this morning, to have that awe over what God has done, and as we look around our own church, what he's doing. And we may not understand why these things are the case, but Paul certainly does know how we should respond. And over the next few chapters of the book, and as Neil Maddock comes to us next week, he's going to help us to understand how do we respond to God's mercy towards us. A few questions for you to think upon, and it will be great if you can come to the house group where we're going to discuss these questions. If there's a bit of a balance between seeing yourself as too far gone for God's grace and thinking yourself strong enough you don't need God's grace, where do you tend to lie? How can you find a better balance? Is there anyone that you think about in your mind that you know that you think is too far gone to experience his grace? Could you reconsider that view? Could you pray for them? Is there anyone that you think, or you don't even consider, could be too strong? Do you think they're too strong to fall from grace? You look at the leaders that we have. They seem okay, but they're just 60 seconds from a mess up. Can you pray for them? Since God has given us such a diverse church, are there any people that you struggle to get along with? How can you improve those relationships? Just a few things to think about from the passage today. We have a great God who is doing great things. Let's call out to him this week. Shall we pray? Father, I want to thank you that although I do not understand you, I know enough of you to know I can be in awe of you over the things that you do. Thank you that no one is too far gone to be redeemed, to be lifted up out of the pit, out of the gutter, into a place of restoration, into your kingdom. Because it's not about our efforts, it's about all that the Lord Jesus has done. Thank you that you bring a whole bunch of diverse people together, and you enable us to together praise and worship you and seek to extend your kingdom. I pray to help us not to be proud or arrogant this week, to think the best of others, to bring out the best in others. You'd help us not to stumble and fall this week. Keep us strong in you, I pray. Amen. Shall we sing our last song, which is going to be When I Survey the Wondrous Cross.